speaker, is that correct? Yeah, Stuart will be our first speaker. Stuart has a long background, and he has provided a short book for us for our autobiography for the page this morning. So you can read about his primary school history, you can read about his secondary school history, you can read about his... Take your time. It's a good read. It's a good read. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing Stuart. He's probably well known to many of you. He has provided us with a network for a long time so we can send out our communications to people throughout this area of interest, and certainly we've always appreciated that. He's been involved with the Biosphere for probably about 15 years by the look of it, and I'm sure he'll give you some background on that as well. Recently it's been stepped up by the appointment of Elia to the group, and Elia will speak after Stuart has spoken. And thank you, Stuart.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you very much for coming today. As you can see from my bio that I provided, there's warts and all you can deal with in there. Our Biosphere group started in 2005 with, where's James? James's grandpa Ray Maino, he's part of Threatened Ecosystems Network, recognised that although we had some pretty good legislation and bodies operating, we still weren't doing enough to protect a lot of the grassland areas. They were still suffering from neglect, mismanagement and so on. And Ray wanted to raise the profile of those grassland ecosystems, and to do so he called a meeting of interested parties, if you like, and we met, I think, at probably the Green Building, 60L in Melbourne, and had our first meeting, and we've continued on from then with a few ins and outs for the committee. And I think primarily we've aimed in the meantime to establish at least a network of interested parties, people who felt similarly about grasslands, that there was much that can do. And as a teacher, I recognised that it was probably through education and communication that we were going to make some progress. And we ticked over for about 10 or 12 years without really making a lot of progress, except for hopefully selling the message, as John has mentioned. And then we've got to the point now when we got our tax-deductible gift recipient status and started to trust that we could actually raise some money, and we've employed Elia now to progress the work of preparing making contact with all the people who are already operating in the field on the ground, the CMAs and DELP and parks and the councils, the LGAs and all the other network groups, so that we can bring people together. And our hope is that we can make grassland restoration, conservation, protection much more efficient across the whole VVP. I think, and Leah will give you a bit of a talk, a good talk, not just a bit of a talk. She'll give you a good talk about the structure of the biosphere and how it works and what we've done today. And then what I hope to do is tap into your knowledge and skills and get something from you about, what for you, what would be the requirements of a biosphere. The biosphere that's established in a particular area is pretty much up to the people who live and work in that area. It's not much good foisting a structure on people if they're not willing to do the work or interested in carrying out things. So we want to make things more efficient for conservation across the whole area. So we're going to rely on your expertise in helping with that. So thank you, Elia. So I'll introduce Elia, who we have employed as what's the term we actually use?
Project coordinator. Project the name we whipped up out of the air.
Yeah, so that's good. And how many people have seen some of Elia's presentations already in different? Yeah, we've been on Biocon, and Elia's had a few other talks in other areas. So I think you'll enjoy it. We don't have the tech, but
just to clarify, of course, we asked Stuart and Elia to speak without AV today simply because we were expected to be outside. So I appreciate their cooperation in that. Most of us are so used to using PowerPoint and things these days, but thank you. And
look, it's a pleasant and very different change, John. That's fine.
Everyone, my name's Elia. As Stuart said, Earlier this year, I started working part-time for the Biosphere Group to help progress an actual nomination to the Biosphere Program, and I'll explain a little more about what that is for those of you who haven't heard about it. Just as a bit of, I guess, my background, I've been in Australia for 9 years, came here to study lizards, because you have the best lizards here. Was pretty, always really interested in ecology, conservation, finished my PhD, wound up working a job in agricultural research, which was a bit of a surprise to me because I wasn't really an area I thought I would get into, for a sustainable agriculture company in the city, which does a lot of work with insect pests, and loved it, and really loved it. Became a lot more, I guess, interested in places where conservation overlaps with agriculture and overlaps with other industries. Got involved with the Biosphere Group as well because of its sort of philosophy of looking a bit broader than just conservation by itself. Can everybody hear me fine? Mm-hmm. And well, we're going low tech today, which I think is kind of nice because I hope this will make it feel a bit less like me giving an hour-and-a-half presentation, which would bore everyone to tears, and can be a bit more of a brainstorming discussion. But I will start with, I guess, a bit more of an explanation about what this Biosphere project actually is, to fill in some of those gaps so that we can answer some questions, and I also can ask you guys a lot of questions. And I will just pull up my notes so I stay on track. So it sounds like a couple of you have caught some presentations I've given in the recent months. I usually like to start with a picture of what the volcanic plains used to look like and looks like now. I really don't have to do that today since you guys spent the morning looking at the Woorndoo Commons, which is about as nice of an example I've ever seen of a restored grassland that brings to mind what these areas might have looked like. And I also think with this audience, I probably don't have to worry too much about trying to convince you why grasslands are important because you just stood in the rain for an hour, soaked to the bone, so we can definitely skip past that. But I don't want to skip completely past why we care about grasslands because this is, I think, a core question of our group, is recognizing that each of us might have our own individual interest in conservation, in restoration, in grassland habitats in particular. But we don't want to forget, I guess, all the other possible reasons people might be interested or why people might love these landscapes. And so I thought as a little starting activity, I have a bunch of sticky notes and pencils, and I'd like to pass them around, and I'm hoping everybody can write down why they care about grasslands, why they want to see them protected or restored. And we can pop them up on the whiteboard and see, what sort of diverse ideas and reasons people have. Because I think it's easy to sometimes think everybody has the same reasons as yourself. So I might just, well, maybe just grab a couple pencils and pass them along with you, or.
Anyone wants to write along with these? Anyone need a pen?
Why do you care about grasslands? Why do you want to see them protected? Why are you here today, pretty much? Yeah. And maybe if on the same sheet of paper while you're at it, you can write down a little note of what your sort of position is. Are you working with government? Are you farming? Are you a local resident? Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Soften it to things.
Yeah, thank you.
And you can summarize that.
All right, James is gonna help look through those and kind of sort them into some themes, and then we can pop the general themes popping out on the whiteboard, and just have a moment, I guess, to appreciate what all the different reasons are that folks are here.
All right, I think we're good.
But I guess just kind of, as a start, based off of folks I've talked to, I can think of quite a lot of very different reasons that are quite different, potentially from my own personal reasons. As I kind of said before, my background is in conservation. I've just always really loved nature, grew up in a pretty bushy area, so it was sort of a given for me that, it's quite a sad feeling to lose these native habitats. But then working in agriculture, I guess, gave me quite another perspective on some of the places where conservation and an appreciation for biodiversity can also overlap with economic goals, which isn't really a dirty thing. It's really a good thing that we can find win-wins between environment and human activities and human development. And that is really the core of what this Biosphere project is all about, is looking for places where protection of the environment and natural habitats doesn't just, I guess, coexist on the side with human activities, but actually benefits, and they bolster each other. So, this biosphere concept, maybe just hands up, has anybody heard of this program run by the United Nations called the Biosphere Program? And had anyone heard of it? If this is the same people that maybe saw my talk in the last couple months, had anyone heard of it before that? Okay, so just a couple. I'll admit I hadn't really heard of it before getting involved with this group, but the more I've learned about it, the more I guess it's sort of stood out as a really unique and pretty ambitious program. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on the program. We'll use this whiteboard to try and explain some of how it sits in the world. But essentially, in the 60s, the United Nations, there was sort of a series of conferences that were going on between the United Nations, some of their departments like the Food and Agriculture Organization, and UNESCO through the UN, having a series of conferences with some of the other large international non-governmental organizations like the World Conservation Union, IUCN, that you might be familiar with the species red lists that they put out, identifying threatened species, as well as the International Council of Science. And so together, I guess, the sort of world it fits in is you've got the United Nations, and you've got these big NGOs, and they created, sort of jointly between them, they created a series of programs that were aimed at addressing the fact that you can't really separate some environmental concerns from human concerns. Particularly, they had a major focus on developing areas of the world where it's hard to promote community development without some impact on the environment. And so the Biosphere Program was one of these. And the sort of sister one that was created from the same series of conferences at the same time was actually the World Heritage Convention, which we're pretty familiar with here, with the listing of Bud Bim recently. So there's a few other programs that came out of these collaborations in the 60s as well, including UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program. So that's sort of the start of this program and where it fits internationally. However, if you're being very sort of honest and critical about the program, it took quite a few years to come into its own. And between the 60s and the 90s, there was a few kind of misstarts and I guess just experimenting with what this program really should look like. It's a pretty ambitious thing to try and say we're here about balancing human development with the environment. The model they settled on was they wanted to create essentially like large pilot studies. They wanted test sites, so they wanted to create these sites all over the world, which would serve as little petri dishes for testing out methods that could balance human development and the environment. So looking at issues like agriculture, the impact of agriculture and biodiversity, or the impact of tourism on conservation, potential ways to raise funding through things like tourism for conservation, but to make sure you're not degrading the natural assets at the same time. And so they came up with this idea of a biosphere, which is an area that gets designated internationally as this Biosphere Reserve. And inside of it, it has 3 focuses. And these 3 focuses really weren't even cemented until 1995, when they kind of figured out what was going to work, what the priority needed to be. And so that sort of sets now the definition for this program. And you might hear about this strategy is called the Seville Strategy from 1995. And it essentially says, all right, the Biosphere Program needs to do 3 things. Each Biosphere Reserve has to do 3 things. The top one is it has to conserve biodiversity, whether it's genetic or species. But the second one is it has to promote sustainable human development. And the third is that it has to provide logistical support to those communities within the Biosphere Reserve through research. And if any one of those criteria can't be met, then the area either won't be designated as a biosphere or it will lose its standing as a biosphere. So right from the get-go, this focus on not just conservation on its own, but conservation in addition to economy and development is really clear in the program. And I think that's what makes it quite unique from a lot of other models. Now, that being said, a lot of the early biospheres didn't do very well because they kind of missed the point of that sort of 2 unified goals there. And particularly in Australia, so Australia actually signed on to the Biosphere Program, I think it was in the 80s. We didn't have any biospheres, but the CSIRO was doing research that was supporting other biospheres, so we joined the program. And then, in I think the 80s, Australia, after the National Park Service was created, we made our first Biosphere Reserves. And the ones that were created then don't exist anymore because they fell into what was a common pitfall trap of early biospheres across the world, which is that they found a national park, nice high value, high conservation value national park, and they drew their biosphere around the park like this. And so that was the biosphere. So you can see how creating this biosphere program around the national park, you're definitely checking the, conservation value, part of the criteria, but you haven't included any of the communities around the area, and you haven't actually opened up this area to input from new stakeholders and new groups. It's still a national park that's managed by the federal government. So we did have up to 13 different biosphere reserves in Australia created between the 80s and the early 2000s, and all but one of those original batch ended up getting delisted. And this is not just true for Australia. The same thing happened in a few other countries. I've just been going through a review of biospheres in Vietnam, and there's this similar issue that some of the early attempts, they weren't really getting at the idea that this is about trying to unify human activities with conservation activities. So this doesn't work so much. So this is not what we want to do. So then in the early 2000s, Australia had sort of a second round attempt at making these biospheres. Really, the kind of world had a second round attempt. There's been a lot more creation of biosphere reserves that have stood the test of time now and are functioning as they're meant to. And essentially what they do now is you still base these biospheres around high-value sites like a national park, but you have to include some of the community areas as well. So the way these reserves are now built is they have 3 zones. There's an inner zone, and it's called the core zone. And the core zone is where we prioritize conservation purposes the highest. And so inside these zones, there are sort of restrictions around how the land is used. The focus is on conservation and research. So this might be an area like a national park or a Ramsar listed wetland, or other conservation reserves, they form these core areas. But then around the core areas, the biosphere creates what's called a transition zone, or a buffer zone. And the buffer zone is meant to circle those high conservation value cores, but they're meant to support them by bringing in more human activity, and I guess human connection with the cores. And they can have people living in them, these buffer zones. They might have small communities. They also would have a lot more tourism activities going on, a lot more focus on educational opportunities for schools, and still more research. And then the biosphere actually gets even bigger than this and has one more wider zone around all of it, which is where you might actually now get large communities of people and even industry. So then there's a much larger zone. That's not a very bright pen, I apologize. And this is called the transition. And you might get more industry, like I'll talk a little bit more about a biosphere we have here in Victoria already. You may have been down to Western Port before. So you might have more fishing activity, or you might have sheep. And you get a lot more settlements. And the focus here is not so much that there's really a lot of high-value conservation land that you're trying to protect. It's more about that you're trying to engage the human areas and connect them to the conservation goals, build ways that businesses can actually benefit from those conservation goals, because if there's sort of economic incentives, that's only going to widen, I guess, the pool of folks who are interested and committed to long-term protection of these natural areas. So the sort of focus on this largest part of the biosphere is creating opportunities to make sure that the development that's happening is sustainable, that it's not degrading the value of the conservation areas, that it's also benefiting from it, in that you're promoting ecotourism, or you're promoting sustainable product branding, and so forth. So that's how these are. This is called a buffer. That's how these are structured. And so when you hear about the biosphere, this is what we're talking about. Is an area that's been designated. UNESCO has looked at this on a map and said, okay, this is a Biosphere Reserve, they call it. It's got its zones where we're prioritizing human to conservation values on a sort of different scale, acknowledging that we can't always have it pushed all the way to the side of conservation. And this is essentially what we want to build for the Victorian Volcanic Plains. And I'll...
I think Aggie had a question.
Yes.
Sorry, can you have multiple core zones?
Yes, and
such a massive area.
we will need to, for sure.
Cool. Okay.
So I'll give you guys now a little bit of a description of a couple other biospheres in Australia, because it helps fill in some of the gaps. But you may have more than one core. Some biospheres overseas do, some of them don't. You may cover only one government area, which makes your job easy, or you may not. I was pretty amazed reading about there's a biosphere in Europe that has just become the first biosphere that covers 5 different nations, which is a pretty impressive logistical feat, but it did take them 20 years or more to build it. Whereas you might get biospheres that are all within one local shire, such as the example of Noosa Biosphere in Queensland, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And depending on how patchy or fragmented the area that you're interested in is, you may need to build a reserve where you've got lots of little cores, and there's a limit, I guess, to how little you can get, because you still have to justify that these each have a high conservation biodiversity value, where you're sort of linking them up and protecting them through these buffer zones. And I guess that question also kind of brings me to the main reasons why we think this program actually would be really well suited for the volcanic plains. Because it's not necessarily the right approach for all areas, and some areas that are quite large tracts of high value conservation land do quite well as a national park. But the reason that we're really interested in this approach is because, as you guys all would well know, the volcanic plains is very fragmented. It sits in an area that has had a long history of agriculture and of human activities, has been really prized for the value it's given to those industries. And at the end of the day, I like to start my talk showing a picture. It's a Photoshop of what the volcanic plains used to look like, using some old paintings from the 1860s and superimposing wildflowers. And it's a beautiful image, but also, I guess, acknowledge that that's not where we're trying to get back to, because that's sort of an unreasonable goal at this point. What we're really looking for is much more of a patchwork between human activities and pockets of remnant land that's being protected or being restored that are not jostling against each other, I guess. So, the Biosphere Program, I guess to underscore, again, the sort of difference between this approach and more traditional conservation approaches is the fact that there's a lot of people living and working in them is really important. There's, I think, 700 Biosphere Reserves across the globe, and there's 2.5 million some odd people living inside of them. So these really are very, they're not like a park or a reserve in the way that we're used to the word. And there's 4 of them in Australia right now. One of them, most of them are quite young. As I said, we sort of had to relearn how to use this program. Arguably our most successful one is just turned 10 in 2018, and this is Noosa, Queensland. Has anyone heard of Noosa Biosphere in Queensland? They actually, 2 months ago, won the UN's highest award for biosphere management. They're definitely doing something right. They've had a few head starts or a few ways that their job will be easier than ours, in that they are just one LGA involved, which makes some of the jurisdiction a bit easier. But I did want to maybe just give a bit of an example about how they work, because it helped me really understand what this program might look like for us. So before I jump into that, did anyone else have questions, I guess, on the basic goals of this Biosphere Program? Yeah, Misha?
Does the buffer have to be contiguous? So if you've got all these little cores dotted around, you just
I
have...
don't think so.
Okay.
So here's one funny thing about the Biosphere Program that's made it a little hard to...
Can I just ask you to repeat the question first?
Oh, yes. Ashley was asking if the buffers all have to be contiguous or if you can have separate areas. One thing that's made it a little hard to get started on understanding what a biosphere actually is because UNESCO is not very prescriptive about what you have to build it like. They just want to know you have fit the 3 criteria. You have to be able to convince them that it is that the core sites you've designated have enough conservation value, and that the rest of your zonation with your buffer and your transition is going to be protecting them well enough, but is also going to be involving human activities enough that you will meet that criteria of sustainable development support. So my understanding is that we can have separate areas. However, there comes a point where if your biosphere proposal looks too patchy and unconnected, UNESCO is going to ask, like, how is this a functioning whole? So on the volcanic plains, I think it's going to be really important for us to have a clear theme around our sort of disparate core sites. So that might be through the geology, through the volcanic geology that unites them. It might be through the cultural history that unites them. That's going to be something to, I guess, workshop as we try and build this large map. And we also don't know right now how big we can even go. Obviously, the volcanic plains is a huge area with 20-something shires and 5 CMAs and at least, I think, 6 native title groups. It's a big map of actors, and we're at the stage now where we're trying to suss out who's sort of interested, who might be in a position to really help champion one of these biospheres, and that'll help us kind of pin down what the map might look like and where the focus, at least as a start, might be. And there's ways you can kind of scale these up. I'll give the example just real quick of Western Port Biosphere down in Mornington Peninsula. They've kind of gone at a 2-phased approach with their biosphere, so they started smaller than they wanted to be, focusing just on their wetlands with an ultimate goal of expanding to the rest of the catchment, because obviously the catchment affects the quality and the health of the wetlands, so we might be able to look at something like that. But maybe before getting into that nitty-gritty, any other questions before I'm going to give you guys just an example of how Noosa and Western Port Biosphere structure, because it just also helps answer some questions about what this looks like and how we build it. Stuart?
Just maybe explain that one concept for the core that we might have would be based around Corangamite, Lake Corangamite and Stony Rises.
Yes.
And that's actually like more of a wetland system than a grassland system. But
Yes.
It does incorporate that as well, so that they're not prescriptive that it has to be a grassland, but that may be a convenient way to do it.
And Budge Bim would be another, I think, pretty obvious core site, particularly in that it's already been recognized by UNESCO for its high value. So we would sort of be needing to look at areas that I guess are the best and largest remnant spots that we can use to structure these cores. Did you have a...
Yeah. I'm not quite clear why the original Australian biosphere setup failed. Was that because there was no one living in the buffer?
It's the idea is that, and I think this will be a little clearer when I draw up how the biosphere structure forms. The idea is that these are not top-down programs. They're meant to be kind of bottom-up programs where there's a lot of community input. So the problem with the early biospheres is they did form, and they probably had some sort of, committee, but the land that was involved was really only the national parks, so it didn't change the fact that the management of those parks was still...
The buffer was part of the
Yeah, I mean, the buffer was like...
And that was part of the national park.
Yeah, even if it was extending outside the national park, the focus, like they went in, I mean, obviously I wasn't part of these, but reading some reviews and speaking to some folks who've been studying these, the focus probably was more on the conservation side of the program. Like it was maybe seen as another vehicle for park-style conservation. So the way they structured it, but probably also the focus of the folks involved in it, just wasn't really looking at extending beyond the actual parkland and trying to bring in, I guess, input from community groups.
So if we had, for example, the Grampians as the Central National Park and all the farmland around it, bordering it, being part of a buffer zone,
Yeah.
does that work with the biosphere concept? Or is
Yeah. I mean, I think it does, and there's a biosphere in Western Australia, and I haven't been able to have many chats with them yet, but one of the 4 biospheres we have in Australia is in Fitzgerald in Western Australia. Theirs is a bit different from the Western Port one here, and the one in Noosa, where the focus is a bit more heavy on tourism, because they're coastal areas, a lot of people go holidaying. I know the one in Western Australia it's based around a national park, but their transition zone is a lot of grazing land. They're sort of run by 2 parties. They have a community committee, and they have a foundation. And particularly the foundation has a really, like you go on their website and it looks very much like a sustainable farming group. So I would say that it can work, and really it should. Like that's what this program is meant to be about. It's meant to be engaging with farming or engaging with tourism. And it doesn't work if it doesn't engage those parts. So yeah, for your sort of imagining the Grampians is a bit easier than the volcanic plains because you have a huge core area that's obvious and well protected, and it's more about creating the connection between that large Grampian National Park core and the surrounding areas. For the volcanic plains, our job's a little harder because we have to work a lot harder at making this unified system of core sites that people are going to recognize and be excited about and see value in protecting.
The one at the Fitzgerald is pretty much based around like a landcare network. With a few add-ons, they take on extra duties and responsibilities, but it was developed from the enthusiasm of a guy who was in landcare over there and recognised they needed to do more. And they had massive salt problems with their farming.
So that's still a biosphere now, Fitzgerald River?
Oh yeah.
It's the oldest one. It's the only one that survived that sort of initial kind of hiccup when the Biosphere Program changed their criteria in the 90s, but they did a bit of a big internal restructure, but they're still going.
Are you able to tell us, is there a standing committee that decides these things, or is there already a formal organisation? Who are these things referred to?
Yes, so I will draw you guys now the structure of how these work and how they're, who manages them, I guess. So I guess that's the other kind of, it's a good thing and it's a hard thing about biospheres. Like I said before, UNESCO's not hugely prescriptive about how they look. They just you just need to prove that they're fulfilling their goals, but beyond that, they can be built however fits under your country's, legislative policies, and also, I guess, the priorities of the members involved, which is why if you look at different biospheres all over the globe, they could look pretty different in how they're run. With the common theme being there's got to be some outlet, some formal outlet for community participation. So I'll give you the example of Noosa and Western Port. So there's UNESCO, and they've got their sort of biosphere department in UNESCO. And then every country who wants to be a part of the Biosphere Program has to sign on with UNESCO that we acknowledge we're part of the Biosphere Program. Australia has done that. I've actually been learning a bit about, has anyone here had known much about the Kanawinka Geopark? Yeah? I've been learning a bit about that, which was another sister program kind of to the Biosphere Program run through UNESCO with, I guess, a less broad focus. Its focus was still, I guess, still with a heavy focus on the capitalizing on tourism for conservation purposes, but with more of a focus on geology. That park mostly fell apart because of legislative issues, in that Australia doesn't recognize that program, which can be a pretty huge hiccup. So at least in this case, Australia has in the past signed on to the Biosphere Program, and I think would be very unlikely to unsign on at this point because there's been growing interest within Australia in this program. And so UNESCO gets linked to the Australian federal government, and the Australian federal government has its Biosphere Committee, and then the Australian federal government's Biosphere Committee links up to each of the biospheres in Australia. So then they link up. There's Fitzgerald, there's Noosa, there's Great Sandy, which is just one council up from Noosa in Queensland. And there's Western Port, which is the one just over in Melbourne. And through, I guess, that network, the idea is that you have multiple biospheres operating in a country, and they're all collaborating together, looking for places where they have the same problems that they want to solve. And they're coordinating with each other, but they're also connecting to biospheres across the globe that might have the same problems. And I think a really interesting example of that was one of the folks involved in Noosa Biosphere was at one of these international biosphere conferences for island nations, and was talking about how amazed he was that there was folks from islands all over the world, and they all sat down, and the central question of that conference was, we have no fresh drinking water on our islands, we have to bring in all of these water bottles for drinking water, and we don't know what to do with them. And so it was just a really good example of how it's the danger of trying to solve the same problem over and over in your own separate worlds, when really a lot of people are working on these same things. And so linking them up is the goal here. So then within each biosphere, they have their own structure as well to try and promote this idea that they are very collaborative and bottom up from the community. So the way Noosa works is, and this is similar for Western Port, they're quite similar, but they're not exactly the same how they're built. But both of them have a foundation that has tax-deductible recipient status, and has a volunteer board of directors. So that's, I'll just call it like the foundation. And so that's one part of the biosphere, and then the other part that sits next to it is the community committee. So Noosa has it in two parts like this. They've got a foundation with 9 volunteer board of directors on it. They're skills-based chosen. They guarantee a certain number of seats for certain representatives, so there's always a council seat, there's always a traditional owner seat, and then they rotate every, I think, 3 years. And then they've got the community committee, which is open to anybody, and I think they have something like 250 members, and that's the avenue for any group with interest to get involved. And so then that's what they call the biosphere. And as I said, Western Port's quite similar in that they have their board of directors. They've been doing some restructuring lately, experimenting with sort of what works best for leveraging these community committees, particularly because they cover 5 councils instead of just 1 like NUSA, so their job's a little harder. And then working alongside the biosphere, so that's the biosphere. Now the biosphere is going to have some funding needs, obviously, and that's one of the biggest questions is how is this funded? Like even just basic operation costs for these groups to be meeting. And for NUSA, because they're just the one LGA, it's probably a bit of a simpler structure, but they have, like somebody needs to champion it, is I guess how we've been describing it. There needs to be a group that sees enough overlap with the goals of the biosphere and their own that they're willing to essentially keep it running. And so for NUSA Biosphere, it's actually the NUSA Shire Council. So NUSA LGA is the champion of the NUSA Biosphere, and they provide the operational costs. They actually also provide grants that are run through the biosphere because they have an environmental levy in their council, but that's of course not always the case. And so they're championing it, providing funding. Then there is external sources of funding that the biosphere has to go out and get to support projects, to support things beyond just the basic operations. And so for that, there's sort of a kind of two-way relationship between a whole bunch of different, I guess what you'd call partners of the biosphere, where they're providing funding or receiving funding if the biosphere is offering, has its own money it's raised for grants, and they're also providing expertise. I'll put it as a little icon. And this is where, I guess, the more diverse this group of partners is, the better. And so in NUSA, they've got partnerships with philanthropic groups like the Thomas Foundation or the Nature Conservancy. They have partnerships with industry groups like Tourism NUSA, with landcare groups, with universities. They've actually got an MOU with Sunshine Coast University. And that's where I guess the meat of the work happens is all these diverse partners getting together on sort of a unified goal that that has some interest for all of them. And an example in NUSA, which is actually what they won the award I mentioned before, that they won the highest award from UNESCO for their biosphere management, was a nice example because it was a project that was looking at the health of the NUSA Riverway. They did a big survey and they found that their oysters were functionally extinct, their fish species were declining, and that right there, there's sort of threefold worries. One, it's a huge cultural loss because those oysters were the traditional food of the Kabi people. It was an environmental loss because oysters are ecosystem engineers. And it was an industry loss because healthy fishing is a big part of what attracts tourists to NUSA, is having healthy fish stocks and healthy river systems. So it was just a good example of three quite, I guess, distinct areas all overlapping in the same goal, which is figure out a way to improve the health of the NUSA River. And they just finished up a project that ran, I think, for most of the 10 years they've been around, which was aimed at erosion control all over the river catchment, as well as creating artificial oyster reefs in the main bay. Ran it as a bit of a pilot program, and it got picked up by the Nature Conservancy that's now put a several $1 million investment into it to roll it out larger. And so that was sort of the goal of that biosphere, was get the partners together, get the expertise together, have everyone on the same page, do these pilot research programs that then can be used to attract the larger organizations and investors. And so that they would view that pretty successfully, that they've been able to now create formal partnerships with Sunshine Coast University, for instance, and have the Nature Conservancy picking up their research.
Just flog that
Yes.
concept of a positive feedback loop.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess what the idea is there's sort of three things that the biosphere is all about. And the three things is that they're about coordination. So with that example of, all the island nations trying to figure out what to do with their fresh drinking water bottles, like, on the first step is there's a lot of people who have the same problems, want to do the same things, and the VVP is such a good example of that because there's, a heap of groups working all over the VVP, in a lot of places doing really great local projects, and already structures trying to link those up as well with the Grasslands Plains Network in Melbourne, the VVP Conservation Management Network. So I think we can all already agree that for a place as fragmented as ours, this coordination is absolutely key. Being able to, share the results of your pilots with other areas, roll these things out on a larger scale, particularly when one of our most limiting factors, it sounds with a lot of restoration work, is just having enough people creating native seed even to support these projects. So the sort of coordinating network. The next one would be recognition. And this is, I guess, kind of similar to, the interest in getting, Budgebim getting a World Heritage status listing, is it does bring you quite a lot of recognition on an international scale, but also on a local scale. You get to say, look, we're part of, an officially accredited international program. What we're doing here has been, viewed by the United Nations as sound and really promising. And with that recognition, you're using that to attract, more groups who want to participate with you as a sort of formal accredited group, and you're attracting higher quality research. And so that's sort of, I guess, the third really important thing about a biosphere. And then the recognition also, attracts tourism, and thus more dollars, which is, of course, of high importance when funding is such a limiting thing in conservation usually. So, anywhere that you can sort of, that you can raise the profile, but also raise awareness of places where, conservation is actually overlapping with economic goals. And this is, I guess, where the feedback loop comes, because the more research you attract and the better the research outcomes, the more credit it gives you with your recognition, and they just kind of bolster each other. And improves funding until, it's going into these, funding's always going to be a hard one to start with, but, this is, I guess, where the goal is by uniting and getting that more strength in numbers, by raising your profile so that, the federal government is paying a bit more attention to the Biosphere Program, because they're not going to pay much attention to it unless the biospheres are banding together, and attracting, more universities and larger research organizations. So, any questions, I guess, on the kind of structuring on how these work? Yeah?
Do you have that common goal in mind for VVP? So you use the example of the oysters and the river elves in Noosa. What would you see, or have you got an idea of what that kind of goal would be for the VVP?
Well, that's actually where I kind of want to, I guess, stop my talking and now ask you guys some questions, because I'm the American I've only been here 9 years. Obviously, I've learned a lot about the volcanic plains in the last year, but I think there's, a lot more ideas and information in this room about what could be the sort of unifying theme of the VVP biosphere. And what I wanted to do is maybe, while I write up some of our Why We Cared notes on the whiteboard, we'll pass around some more sticky notes, or also just, we can just have folks raise hands, but there's a few questions that I'd have for you guys. And a big one would be hearing about, I guess, how this program runs, and its sort of basic philosophy is, what would you be wanting to get out of it? Does it sound like something that would help with the gaps that you see? And if so, I guess what sounds most appealing? Because these things, because they're quite flexible, I guess, in how they get built, they can be pretty purpose-built by the folks who are making them. So maybe we can either pass cards around, or we can just have folks raise their hand. Does anyone have some, I guess, thoughts on what they would want to get out of a Biosphere program getting established here?
Pass them around.
You pass them around?
We can do
Okay.
both at the same
Okay.
time.
couple of examples I'd put in there is regenerative agriculture, just to encourage that, so there was a uniform approach across the VVP. Product loyalty for clean green products, that sort of thing. So, you know, people had support in doing that, possibly even being able to harvest perennial native grasses for you know, flour and whatever other products there are. Maybe even commercially harvesting yam daisy. You know, they do produce a good tuber. I've got a little plot at home about as big as the billiard table, which is producing, you know, quite a good crop at the moment. You know, all those sort of things, and you can see there's a lot of interest in indigenous foods, in bush foods. You know, there's avenues there too, not to take them from the wild, but to actually cultivate them and then promote an interest in our genetic variety in our native plants. Lots of different projects that different people can take up and would get support for doing, but it's very difficult to do at the moment.
Stuart, can I ask a question while Leah's busy there?
What, weren't you?
With working within a biosphere, would businesses be concerned about being hit up for a levy to help fund the biosphere?
Probably not. We're trying to avoid the term reserve, you know, Biosphere Reserve, because we see it more as a facilitator than a reserve. And while businesses would be welcome to contribute if they felt that was worthwhile, we don't see that would necessarily, you know, unless something like Southern Farming Systems wanted to put in to develop, you know, work in that area. You know, we wouldn't say no, you can't do that. But if, you know, if there are commercial ventures that want support, we'd see it the other way around, really. We'd try and attract government funding for people to do that sort of thing, rather than saying, you know, you've got to pay a levy to be part of it.
Yeah, well, I was just concerned that people, when they hear about it, they might think, oh, hell, you know, we're going to be hit up here to run this thing.
Yeah, no, we definitely don't want to.
Sort of,
Yeah.
You're paddling uphill before you start. Sort of.
Yeah.
That's the hard thing about the funding, because there obviously has to be some amount of base funding to get it up and running. The other biospheres in Australia, the ideas that come internally from councils, so I guess that sort of answered the right off the bat question for them as far as who's funding the start. And it's because the councils wanted a biosphere, so, you know, Noosa Shire took on the cost of getting it up and running. Western Port Biosphere has a cost-sharing arrangement with their 5 councils. They had some outside money that helped them start up from the federal government, but I don't think we can always rely on that. But for the most, I mean, I guess what I've been learning about the biospheres here in Australia, and a little less so, I guess, internationally, because the systems start to get a bit different. But I guess the idea that I've been forming is that councils are going to be pretty important as far as where some of that basic funding comes from. Yeah, and I think it's pretty unlikely that anyone's going to want to sign off on getting a new levy or anything. Like, I guess I said Noosa's had a couple reasons why they had maybe an easier go than we would. One being their council had already had an environmental levy for quite a long time. They didn't introduce a new one for the biosphere. That probably would have made it a lot harder to get up off the ground. They're a reasonably wealthy council. They have a lot of tourism. So it's going to be a tricky one for us, for sure. Yeah?
Leah, the Noosa example, obviously they have a national park there. Do they have a fragmented model as well, or is it based solely on the national park?
It's I wouldn't go so far as to say it's fragmented, but looking at their maps, they have brought in more core sites than just their national park. They're cool because I think they've embraced more than the other 3 here. The bringing in the communities into the borders. So they've got their core area is, I think, 2 or so nautical miles out to sea. Then they've got their national park. They've got some of the beach areas, and then they've got a few reserves. They've also got some of the hinterland areas as well. And then they're all circled by a really big buffer zone. So I guess that's what kept all the cores together. Their buffer zone covers all of the communities living in their hinterland. Their transition zone, which is the highest human impact one, is actually only the high-density area that they identified in their urban footprint mapping that they had done before starting up the biosphere. So they actually have a pretty small transition zone where, you know, it's the furthest towards the human focus. Yeah. Did,
Just, I have a vision that we were looking perhaps at the flora and fauna of BDP, but maybe it's greater than that. It's Stuart just talked about with regenerative agriculture. What would our core, I mean, what is our aspirational or real core value? Is it something like the state government's 5,000 acre Grasslands Reserve that actually isn't happening? Maybe I'm behind the ball game here.
No, you're right there, Liz, it's okay, you're quite safe in saying that.
But maybe everyone else is up to speed. I'm a little bit sort of confused about what our core value would be if we were to promote it to someone else.
yeah, and I think that's fair because I'm not sure we really have established what our core value is, because I think it's hard to do that before having, you know, knowing who's interested in what their core values are. I guess personally, I would see the core value of the biosphere extending beyond, you know, just protection of native flowers or grasses, and extending into ways of bringing native habitats into farming businesses. You know, places looking, you know, there's a lot of recent interest in agriculture and soil health, for instance. You know, I've kind of seen that from my days working in ag research, which is really exciting because there's a lot of places that overlaps with healthy biodiversity. You know, there could be places where we find overlap with native grass habitats in farming. I know the Tiverton Farm is a place that's looking at just those sorts of opportunities. Yeah, but I guess it's hard to answer because the kind of core value of the biosphere comes from, you know, is sort of crowdsourced from the groups who are interested in the concept. I don't know if that was a satisfying answer, but I guess what I'm saying is I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on what your values are.
What would Liz's value?
Yeah.
Well, I've made a presumption, and I think everything you've spoken about is really, really what, you know, we would all be hoping for. But I've sort of presumed it was caring for, retaining, enhancing what we've got that's really under threat at the moment, and all those other things maybe a means of getting there. And would they, I don't know whether they were a means of getting there or core value, or I guess I'm just absorbing it.
I'll chip in on that.
Yeah.
Just, you mentioned the Western Grassland Reserve, I presume, and that's probably a good example of why something like a biosphere is needed, because as it's administered by Delphin Parks, you can see it's just crap. You know, they are subject to too much financial constraints to be really able to do something. They're railroaded by the developers. Was it Adrian Marshall was going to come?
No, he apologised late last night. He is officially a winner.
So the Grassy Plains Network has been dealing with Delphin Parks over that Western Grassland Reserve, and that was land that was supposedly set aside for conservation to act as offsets, but it's effectively being used as land banking, and there's no real pressure for the people who are land banking to control weeds. So it's just progressively deteriorating. It's a shame. And the Grassy Plains Network is working really hard to try and turn that around. But it's just...
However, Stuart, we mustn't lose sight that the area is reserved.
The area is reserved.
And, you know, we've got the rest of time to solve all of these problems.
I hope so, yeah.
And what we mustn't allow happen is that it becomes a political issue, so that the reserving, through some process I wouldn't understand, fails completely.
Yeah.
So I think it's still wonderful that area is reserved.
Yeah. It does need improving.
No, but there will be stuff happening out there.
Yeah.
So let's just not talk it down too much. And I'm not talking to you, others I've heard talking down too much.
Yeah, stay positive.
We mustn't make it politically easy
Yes.
to reverse that process.
Yeah.
Elia, could I just, I think, Belle, you had something to say anyway. So.
I was just going to say, I feel quite unnerved by some of it, but I really like the idea of people being able to appreciate where they live and to learn about it, and I could see this as a way that you could enjoy and be proud of where you live and learn about it, but how people don't just sit. I feel anxious that there might be things that puts pressure on that you lose, like grasslands with development. So there's how you can learn about and appreciate where you are, look after it, but not see it as somewhere to be exploited.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe I'm off track, but like I can kind of envision this situation maybe where you've got your core area being a high value grassland that maybe hasn't been managed very well, and then in managing that and doing research into the values of that, you're also, say, doing research about the carbon in the soil there, or how the biodiversity is having a positive impact on agriculture outside, and then that kind of gives it that credibility that like, oh, it's got these other human values other than just biodiversity, but all of the like valuing it just for the sake of it being like remnant grassland is happening at the same time, rather than focusing on the human. I think people maybe because it's such a fragile, fragmented thing, is sort of like scared to talk about, maybe like consider that we have to think about farmers and how the grasslands are benefiting farmers when we're just like trying to, grasp onto the last little daisy that we've got left.
I mean, I do think that like the original purpose of this program, when it was created, was coming from a primarily conservation purpose. Like you wouldn't bother with it if you were just wanting to focus on development. We've got, that's pretty easy to do when you're not also trying to, be careful, tiptoeing around the environmental issues. So, the Biosphere Program at its heart is, I would say, a conservation-focused program. But I guess and I do see your kind of point that, if we're focusing on all these other things, well, are we not even going to be able to do the basic protection? But I think it's also about maybe trying to recognize opportunities that might make that basic protection easier than it is now, and maybe trying to expand the interested parties who are keen on that protection to folks that maybe we weren't working with originally. But yeah, I mean, does anyone else have, maybe I should have repeated the question if people couldn't hear, kind of thoughts on that sort of worry of if you're sort of moving the focus too far from, protecting the patches, if there's, kind of a worry that we'll lose, progress on where we are now?
I've been thinking about the core area as remnant vegetation, and there's lots of little teeny tiny patches of remnant. And then the buffer zone is the agricultural land surrounding it, which may have some native vegetation in it. So we've got a huge buffer zone and only teeny tiny cores. And how does that balance out? Like, is the goal to... Does the biosphere include remnant and revegetation, and does it have to be like a 50-50 split? Like, I don't think you have the answers, but this is sort of what I'm wondering about as thinking about biosphere.
Yeah, even if they don't explicitly say numbers as far as like what your ratios have to be, if your core sites are too small, I think you'd have a hard time convincing UNESCO that you've got a valuable conservation program. Would definitely be a problem if all you've got is, if your cores are just small roadside remnants and you don't have, any larger parks. I'm hoping that for our benefit, as long as we, do have some of those larger sites like Fletch Bim or like Karangamite, it can give you kind of the framework, and some of those roadside remnants might actually fall within buffer areas. The Noosa Biosphere actually created their own zone. They created a fourth zone that sort of suited their purposes, where they were looking at small sites that weren't quite good enough to be a core, where they were trying to still have a bit more protection and regulations around activities in those sites. So I think with some, brainstorming, we could, come up with ways to get around this. And I guess that's sort of the goal of getting folks with a lot of expertise together to talk through the issues we face. Is if anyone's got creative ideas as far as how we do deal with the fact that what we would want to be our core, some of those sites are pretty small. Any ideas on that? Got a few hands up.
I don't think UNESCO would knock back the application because there wasn't enough left to conserve. It was too fragmented. I mean, that would, it's partly a problem, but it's also partly making a case, we need to act fairly soon to make sure what little fragments we do have left are well conserved.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't mean to imply, like, if it's too small, they won't like it, but I guess you have to show that you've got a plan for, how you're going to leverage the little bit that is left. And I think that's, probably where the network needs to look pretty strong as well. Yeah?
And I've sort of had reason to think about all this a fair bit, not in this context, but the interesting, well, we've got various vegetation types out here, but one of the ones that, and the one we focus on here primarily is the grassland, or let's leave the trees out of it for a moment, but we mustn't forget that there's also the eucalypt understory, the eucalypt in the understory, which needs larger space. But the grasslands don't need a lot of space to function as a plant community. But we have vast kilometres of rural roadside, and even this group alone has demonstrated that you can build a reasonable semblance of original vegetation on those roadsides. Now, I think until now I haven't ever sort of had the ambition of covering every rural roadside with native vegetation. It'd be lovely, but that seemed impractical. But I just wonder if there's a model where you can say, well, we have the remnants, we have people, Ben and other, the CMA, Aggie, ourselves, working towards reconnecting those remnants where we can. It's a big task, but we're developing those techniques. And then we have all the Polaris roadside, which no one is particularly fond of, that I'm aware of. Now, others may step in and say there is some value in that, and I'm willing to listen to that argument. But at the moment, I see it as more of a problem than a solution. And we have a vegetation type within our grasslands that is extraordinarily suited to those broad roadsides for easy management. I'm just wondering if there's a model where you can, part of your core is in fact the road network, and you have an ambition to eventually move, have an ongoing, a rolling activity, which is the replacement of difficult roadside vegetation with a much more amenable, much more attractive, locally contextual landscape, which, I keep saying, you get the rest of time for diversity, you can do a relatively simple version of it, which seems to work. Now, not on all country, you've got limitations to where you can do it, but at the moment, we know there's a lot of country you could do it on. It's a vast amount of public land. I know that we also talk about a system whereby landholders are subsidised initially, not necessarily forever, but are subsidised initially to have a complementary strip inside their fence line, which is laid down to restored grassland as well, which at least doubles the width. That would have to be, obviously there have to be incentives for that initially, but we've already talked about the possible benefits to agriculture of the native vegetation for a range of reasons. So if that becomes a proven, as I was saying before, you've got to build it before they'll come, but if that becomes a proven advantage to landholders as well, then perhaps the subsidy system is not quite so critical in the longer term. Now, I won't see this, but I'm just wondering if the vision mightn't be that part of your core area is this massive roadside network. And where you've got three-chain roads, you've got a huge amount of area. But even on the narrow side of those three-chain roads, if you have a landholder who's willing to put a strip inside that narrow, the narrow strip, which is basically Polaris these days, then you've suddenly got a restorable area. You can't work on that very, very narrow bit, but if you've got the additional land of the landholder, who receives reasonable compensation, not from the local people, but from the whole society, because this is a societal benefit, then I just wonder if there's not a model where you can at least have part of your core area defined as the road network.
It'd be,
Roads or transport now, as they are already interested in these techniques. We're a long way from applying them on a huge scale, but the rural industries that could be built around seed production, restoration, all these things, they're all industries that would have to be located within a region. I just think that there is probably a model there that we may be able to convince the authorities that if this public land is available, then now there's also all the story about private land, but I guess I've focused on public land, so that's my particular focus. But we have massive amounts of land available. Should we choose and should we have a capacity to use it?
yeah, I think,
The grasslands don't need a lot of, you're going to put trees up, sure, you need large space. But for the time being, we can do this at relatively small scales and still have a functioning vegetation system which is worth having.
yeah, I mean, it probably just comes down to the parties who, I guess, are responsible for those roadsides being on board, and you'd have councils and Vic Roads. I guess who else would be, need to, because if you're putting these roadsides into the core, you're putting, strings attached, I guess, on what can happen on those sites. But I wouldn't see that there's any particular reason why you couldn't try that as a model. It's a question maybe to bring up with Peter Bridgewater, who's our Australian biosphere expert, has a lot of thoughts on how you build those zones. But I mean, what would you think might be, I guess, the biggest sources of resistance, listing roadsides as the highest level of protection sites?
I'm not even suggesting that necessarily, but that be seen as a resource for a biosphere into the distant future.
Yeah.
You're not going to do this in a generation, but
I was going to ask Amy and Frank, maybe to give us some idea of like the ratio of our present grasslands. A lot of it, probably most of it, is on roadside and railway reserves. You've got to figure.
Within the Crown Reserve or compared to private lands?
Compared to the whole lot, all remnants of native grassland, a significant portion, as I understand.
And it's not all equal as well.
no, that's the other issue.
I can't give you a percentage or a number, but I can say that it's adequately mapped and surveyed, so we've got a pretty good picture of it.
And John and Paul's work in the past has shown that sort of thing is quite possible. And you probably have to do a budget and think, what's it cost for Polaris and fire management, and what does it cost for restoration? You're probably going to, over the long term, you'll probably come out ahead.
But there's also the added benefit of tourism. I mean, there are a whole lot of add-ons that if you're driving past, sure, they're seasonal, but they're seasonal over, we tend to think it's just spring, but it's not. I mean, the feminine grasslands look fantastic on our roadsides over a much longer period. And then there is all the other benefits of not having. David, do you have anything to say about Polaris roadsides? I mean, do you see am I arguing against local interest here? I just see the fire risk that they.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously an interested participant would be the CFA, because they'd be the ones managing the roadsides probably. They'd be left managing it. But no, they are an important part of the volcanic plains. But I just commenting on your point, I think it's too narrow. I think if you're talking biosphere, I'm talking big. If you're talking volcanic plains, the roadsides are certainly an important part of that, but they're only a small part. And then there's all the rest of the production stuff, the tourism stuff.
Oh, sorry, please don't
volcanic
misunderstand.
plains.
I'm just saying that I see that as a public resource which is available to to the biosphere as an ongoing.
Yeah, more than they are, they're part of it.
Yeah,
The
that's right.
biosphere would be much more, you know, globally encompassing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I just got a chicken here.
Yeah, so when you were asking about what ideas for aspirations for the grasslands in general, perhaps what might fit in with this program, yeah, I'll say, yeah, to think about the restoration work, I think that's something that's, you know, the research has been done, it's been proven as a technology that works, and we really just need to have expand on that and have the people and the groups and the funding to do it, and the main limitation is the seed. So to have, you know, if it fit within this program, to have a larger scale and more coordinated seed production, that would be great, and it would complement other aspirations in terms of the tourism attraction of the grasslands. I think that's really undersold at the moment, and the people that do know about grasslands and love them are going out to little sites to appreciate them, but it's not managed in such a way that it generates an income to put back into the conservation of these areas. And I'm sure people here love the grasslands enough that they'd be happy to you know, make a contribution every time they were out there appreciating it. And international visitors don't even know to go and see this stuff and appreciate it because it's not promoted and marketed and managed in a way that we can coordinate a sustainable tourism enterprise that generates its own income. So they were two, and the third one I wanted to throw into the mix was the cultural values of the VVP as a landscape, and you know that we do have the recognised registered Aboriginal parties, and for them to be supported to do traditional land management practices, including burning, which will help to manage the site, that there's just so much red tape around getting that happening at the moment, but just the
roads, you've got a huge amount of area. But even on the narrow side of those three channel roads, if you have a landholder who is willing to put a strip inside that narrow, the narrow strip, which is basically Polaris these days, then you've suddenly got a restorable area. You can't work on that very, very narrow bit, but if you've got the additional land of the landholder, who receives reasonable compensation, not from the local people, but from the whole society, because this is a societal benefit, then I just wonder if there's not a model where you can at least have part of your core area defined as the road network. Roads or transport now, as they are already interested in these techniques. We're a long way from applying them on a huge scale, but the rural industries that could be built around seed production, restoration, all these things, they're all industries that would have to be located within a region. I just think that there is probably a model there that we may be able to convince the authorities that if this public land is available, then now there's also all the story about private land, but I guess I've focused on public land, so that's my particular focus. But we have massive amounts of land available. Should we choose and should we have a capacity to use it?
Yeah, I think
the grasslands don't need a lot of, you're going to put trees up, sure, you need large space. But for the time being, we can do this at relatively small scales and still have a functioning vegetation system which is worth having.
Yeah, I mean, it probably just comes down to the parties who, I guess, are responsible for those roadsides being on board, and you'd have councils and Vic Roads. I guess who else would be, need to, because if you're putting these roadsides into the core, you're putting, strings attached, I guess, on what can happen on those sites. But I wouldn't see that there's any particular reason why you couldn't try that as a model. It's a question maybe to bring up with Peter Bridgewater, who's our Australian biosphere expert, has a lot of thoughts on how you build those zones. But I mean, what would you think might be, I guess, the biggest sources of resistance, you know, listing roadsides as the highest level of protection sites?
I'm not even suggesting that really necessarily, but that be seen as a resource for a biosphere into the distant future.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to do this in
Yeah.
a generation, but
I was going to ask Amy and Frank, maybe to give us some idea of like the ratio of our present grasslands. A lot of it, probably most of it, is on roadside and railway reserves. You've got to figure.
Within the Crown Reserve or compared to private lands?
Compared to the whole lot, all remnants of native grassland, a significant portion, as I understand.
And it's not all equal as well.
no, that's the other issue. It's not all equal.
I can't give you a percentage or a number, but I can say that it's adequately mapped and surveyed, so we've got a pretty good picture of it.
And John and Paul's work in the past has shown that sort of thing is quite possible. And you probably have to do a budget and what's it cost for Polaris and fire management and what's it cost for restoration. You're probably going to, over the long term, you'll probably come out ahead.
But there's also the added benefit of tourism. I mean, there are a whole lot of add-ons that if you're driving past, I mean, sure, they're seasonal, but they're seasonal over, we tend to think it's just spring, but it's not. I mean, the feminine grasslands look fantastic on our roadsides over a much longer period. And then there is all the other benefits of not having. David, do you have anything to say about the roadsides? I mean, do you see am I arguing against local interest here? I just see the fire risk that they
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously an interested participant would be the CFA, because they'd be the ones managing the roadsides probably. They'd be left managing it. But no, they are an important part of the volcanic plains. But I just commenting on your point, I think it's too narrow. I think if you're talking biosphere, I'm talking big. If you're talking volcanic plains, the roadsides are certainly an important part of that, but they're only a small part. And then there's all the rest of the production stuff, the tourism stuff.
Oh, sorry, please don't
volcanic
misunderstand.
plains.
No, I'm just saying that I see that as a public resource which is available to the biosphere as an ongoing.
Yeah, thought and they're part of it.
Yeah,
The
that's right.
biosphere would be much more, globally encompassing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Amy's got a chicken here.
Yeah, so when you were asking about what ideas for aspirations for the grasslands in general, perhaps what might fit in with this program, I'll say, to think about the restoration work, I think that's something that's, the research has been done, it's been proven as a technology that works, and we really just need to have expand on that and have the people and the groups and the funding to do it, and the main limitation is the seed. So to have, if it fit within this program, to have a larger scale and more coordinated seed production, that would be great, and it would complement other aspirations in terms of the tourism attraction of the grasslands. I think that's really undersold at the moment, and the people that do know about grasslands and love them are going out to little sites to appreciate them, but it's not managed in such a way that it generates an income to put back into the conservation of these areas. And I'm sure people here love the grasslands enough that they'd be happy to make a contribution every time they were out there appreciating it. And international visitors don't even know to go and see this stuff and appreciate it because it's not promoted and marketed and managed in a way that we can coordinate a sustainable tourism enterprise that generates its own income. So they were two, and the third one I wanted to throw into the mix was the cultural values of the VVP as a landscape, and that we do have the recognised registered Aboriginal parties, and for them to be supported to do traditional land management practices, including burning, which will help to manage the site, but there's just so much red tape around getting that happening at the moment, but just the tying it in with what Stu mentioned, with the being able to educate people and use the traditional foods and medicines, and perhaps even have that owned by the appropriate mobs for them to generate an income and make a business out of that kind of thing.
Can I ask you one question?
Oh, that's all right. No, he'll just Amy.
I'll just ask one question back. So you're sort of sense that that the availability of seed is really the main limiting factor on rolling out rolling out some of the research that you've already got in hand.
Yeah.
If that problem got solved, I guess I'm interested. Where do you think might be the sort of main funding? I guess that those projects that could then go in and do more wide-scale restoration works. Where would you see the main funding support coming from?
Big road.
Well, not on the council one, not on the roadside, not the council roadside. Earlier, you asked the absolutely pertinent question of this whole business, because we don't have a market until we have a demand. We don't have a demand until we have a market. So we can't develop a demand because we don't have the resource to meet the immediate requirements. But the demand doesn't develop because there isn't a resource for them to work with. Now, where the funds come from is that's a whole novel question for something like a biosphere, because it won't necessarily be absolutely traditional. A biosphere would have to find new and more stable ways of providing funding for these sorts of programs. And even, for instance, David's comment about the CFA, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be the CFA that does all of the work. I mean, they're volunteers. It may have to be a more commercial model than that to maintain as we build. But this is not going to happen in 10 years. It's something that needs to be committed to and then developed over a long period of time.
The funding I would see is coming from the tourism industry, because the tourism industry would be the most ones to receive the most benefit. Now that would be in the form of their taxation. So if the tourism industry would be taxed, obviously, and a portion of that tax should go back into the funding of the environment, of the roadside reserves in that grasslands.
Yeah, I see this, personally I see this as a whole of community issue, and it shouldn't be seen as a local responsibility to fund these things necessarily. Now, I agree with you about tourism, but even just the boost to local industry, etc., all the cafes, and where's Ron? And he's making a fortune out of his coffee van, for instance. I mean, we've got to hit him hard.
If I can give two positive examples of the tourism aspect. The Biosphere has, under normal times, runs in autumn a tour to someone who's farming on native grassland. And we've only been able to do one farm. We have two.
I've only been once, but I think there was 2 trips.
And then they've done 2 spring tours where we've been to Camperdown, we've been to Budgebin, and we have 20, 30 people along, and we make a bit of money out of it. We don't try to make money, we just try to cover our costs. But that's just one trip a year, so that mechanism is there, because there are people who are interested in coming and seeing how this sort of thing works, or just coming and visiting the areas. And the Camperdown one and the Budgebin one involve lots of different geological features, as well as the native grasslands, as well as farming, as well as Aboriginal culture.
roadsides would be what you would do under that.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's where your focus would be as part of our kind of, the geology in the area is what is that uniting factor. I see is the volcanic plains.
I think,
Yeah, I've had my hand sort of dangling out. This is sort of, I suppose, a question slash statement, and Elia, this is expressly to you, given your country of birth. Every time I listen to John Morgan, he talks about, you know, the three largest volcanic plains in the world, and we're the third largest, and he always talks about how the Americans really celebrate their prairies, and they've just got a totally different attitude to their grasslands over there. Do you know how, is that just because he talks about, you know, the pioneers and going on in the carriages and everything? What are we doing wrong? Are we too young that we don't care about, you know, Major Mitchell coming through and calling this the Australia Felix? And because I think, like, this is all amazing, but we've got to have every single person, like, caring about this, not just the nerds like us who love going and, you know, squatting down in the pouring rain looking at flowers. We need to get the people who farm it and live alongside it, so therefore have that responsibility, whether they like it or not. You know, if they're on the back of a CFA truck and, you know, they're told by people like us that, oh, it's really important that you burn this at the right time. I think, as part of this, to make this work, we need to build that culture, and, you know, this is all the, I suppose, you know, community-based social marketing sort of stuff, like making people appreciate and love what we've got, because I don't know, like, why do the Americans love their grasslands so much and we just don't?
I have some, I guess, suspicions, and obviously I'm reasonably young, and I come from desert country rather than prairie country, but I mean, I guess I have been thinking a bit about, in fact, last week I was reading Paul Gibson-Roy's paper from his America trip, which was pretty, Oh yeah, Paul Gibson-Roy's going to join us at the AGM and share. I find him pretty ridiculously inspiring. So, but anyways, I mean, yeah, I was reading a bit about his America trip, and I guess we've in the sort of agricultural interests, like we've kind of been reading on some of the American farms that are really into the kind of regenerative agriculture, and I guess just more generally, I guess I've always kind of thought there was a pretty big difference in conservation in America and Australia, and I guess I personally believe that some of it just comes back to, we have a pretty long history of conservation, not always just stemming from how much we love nature purposes. If you want to watch a really good documentary, Ken Burns National Park documentary, James and I have been watching that recently, and like, it's fascinating because it goes into the story of why America created this national park system, which is arguably the best thing we've done for the world. You know, we've got a lot of things that are not so nice to share, but that's something that, you know, we are really proud of creating. And the national park system was really birthed by two individuals, one who was a incredibly fervent nature enthusiast who was raised by an incredibly religious father, and he had the exact same fervor, but instead of religion, it was directed towards nature. And then the other was our president, who loved to go shoot things and was so angry that when he went on this trip with John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt that, you know, he couldn't even shoot a single mouse. So we do have like a pretty long tradition of conservation coming pretty hand in hand with hunting in particular. Our Migratory Bird Act, again, was something that was promoted pretty heavily by hunting communities because they wanted to continue to hunt the birds. So I do think that gave us, I guess, a good basis of keeping the perspective on where conservation can overlap. And like I said, I'm not from prairie land. I come from the Great Basin Desert, but even just studying rangeland management at my undergrad there, again, like the hunting community is, when you are studying ecology in Reno, a lot of people are big into deer hunting, and that's, you know, a major way that we are managing conservation areas. So that's, I guess, always a sort of, I guess, impression I've had comparing America to Australia, and I do think that's, you know, one of the things that you know, I would like to see Australian conservation striving further towards, you know, coming from a background studying at Australian universities and knowing how easy it is to kind of get into your, into your blinders of, well, why doesn't everybody want to save this one random lizard that I work on? Like, you should all know that it's awesome. Is, I guess, keeping those blinders a bit wider. And I guess the other thing that I don't really know exactly, what it means, but even the sort of sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture movements here and in America, it can be quite religious in America as well. Like, there's some of the big names of folks who have become, I guess, the sort of leaders of those movements back home are very, very religious people who sort of also see it wrapping up into their responsibility of stewardship. Yeah, and I guess it's just another, and I think James can weigh in.
So tying back, I guess, to the role of the biosphere as a coordinator, but also as a vehicle for education and development of materials and resources to, I guess, increase awareness across the general public. There's no reason why we can't strive towards that vision, and the biosphere can't contribute to that. Because I think it's going to be important, right, to raise the profile of, as you say.
Elia, sorry.
I just want to follow that a bit. I think many of us have read Wilkinson Roy's Churchill response, but the impact of this perhaps is most important is the benefit to the rural communities. And I envisage Woorndoo as being like some of the communities he spoke about, where the seed production industry is a vital agricultural industry. It has become a big employer of not just the people working in the field, it's infrastructure people. It's a lot of people, and I think we've all got an opportunity, responsibility to talk about that. But the other thing, we'd probably all spend a few dollars to come to something like this. Perhaps we need to say to the cafe owners, we're here, we've just spent $50 on lunches, and you've probably got a budget to spend, I don't know, some money on lunches for a grassland thing tomorrow. The cafe that will benefit from that, they need to know this is why they're getting their $50, $100, $500. I don't know, we might call it a hotel. How much are they going to
Absolute fortune. Absolute fortune.
No, it is. It will be, better than the best business we've done in a few days. So I think every time we do something, we need to say, well, here, we're spending this money. But lots of rural industries depend on $5 and $10 transactions. You know that sort of, we always have opportunities to sell. And to talk about the economic benefits. And once this is a cafe, everyone said it should be a cafe in Woorndoo. Fantastic. There isn't a phone box. There's a mobile cafe. So we can all do a little bit, and it might only be a little bit, but it sort of creates some interest. And I come across people who are really astounded that we have wildflowers in our region. Absolutely stunned that we have wildflowers. Oh, you've been to Western Australia? No, this is Woorndoo, this is Hamilton, this is.
Can I just add to what Liz is saying? I think there are lots of people who are stunned about the wildflowers that we have in the area, but I think even more significantly is that they don't appreciate the significance of these wildflowers out of our native grasslands. And I think that's following on from what Aggie said and something that Amy said too, that is probably, I think, the biggest challenge is educating local people that for example, in the Woorndoo area alone, just how significant our native grasslands are. And I think it's just testament today that there's only, I counted here, 5 people from Woorndoo and Chatsworth, and we're all on the committee of the Woorndoo Chatsworth Landcare Group. And I think that's really sad. And despite our efforts, it's just, we really struggle to find people locally interested in this area.
I think that's where businesses saying that we can bring people to the area and go to the wildflowers, and businesses will benefit from spending money in our cafes.
And then we're even up against a mayor of our shire who wants to raise the local roadsides.
I think but I don't think this will work if we expect everyone to love us. I think it's got to work for them, and so therefore we can't just rely on teaching people to love us. It's not that. I'm very conscious of the time, Leah.
Yeah, we've actually done well
So
keeping
did
the
you have any
chats going.
wrap up that you wanted to do, or
I mean,
we have plenty of time to chat amongst ourselves. But
maybe just to finish, we had even just in this group of folks who are committed enough to go stand in the rain. Like there's a pretty good diversity of reasons, and we just put some groupings. There was quite a few folks mentioning landscape function of grasslands. Quite a few folks just saying that wildflowers are beautiful, and we love how beautiful they are. The value of reducing fire risk along roadsides came up a couple times. The fact that they have historical precedence. They were here first, they have a right to be here came up. And also several times that there's just an inherent value of biodiversity. I liked the one, it's a good intellectual challenge to figure out how to protect these sites. And there was several also around this idea of wanting to learn more and wanting to share more. And so, yeah, I thought that's even, a pretty interesting spread. And you could almost group them into, things that would fit quite well with tourism focus around beauty and around education, things that fit, quite well under conservation and research focus, and even things that, fit quite well with economic uses and farming and practical purposes. So, to keep the picture broad, yeah.
Can I just add one quick thing? So I'm adding to what Jelena said. I like the idea of the geology and people can see it and appreciate it, but somehow marry it to the culture and to the vegetation. It's just I come from, I've had people say to me that they like Mount Elephant without trees on it because it was more like an elephant. So I really like the idea that the geology is integral to the vegetation, and it's not just, so somehow we've got to marry the two, because the geology gives you a really good definition.
Each town,
But layer the layer on it, yeah.
each
layer it.
town has a local Mount Rouse or Mount Shadwell.
But think about it with things on them.
And I guess I personally feel like the appreciation for things on the mountain, like you get when you understand like how cool some of the function is. So that's, I think, where ecology can really shine. Yeah.
Now we all understand we are actually on an active volcanic area. So what we really need is another volcano.
I was just thinking that on the drive over.
Really get some attention going.
Well, it's going to happen in 100,000 years.
Well, we'll hang around.
Well, thanks everybody for having a listen and sharing your ideas. And for the rest of the walk today, I guess I'd love to hear if anyone else had thoughts about, feasibility or the purpose. Please come chat.
Website.
Oh yeah. Oh. We have a website and we have a Facebook group. And it helps the more people that are on there because it helps us make our case when we go and talk to councils and politicians that people actually care. But
Any council representatives?
Jill Parker was still a councillor? No, very much. She was an apology for today, just to mention that. But,
Can I just chip in? What Liz was saying before, like the Lake Bollock Eel Festival is a wonderful model of that respects the culture and the geology, and there's talks about it. And I'd like to bring people's attention to this book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a ripper read comparing, it's talking about the American Indian culture, and it's such a strong parallel with our own Aboriginal culture in the way they respect the land and use the food and so on. It's a really, really inspiring read. And what I would like from you on your sticky notes is what you see that the biosphere would do for you, how it would help in your own work. We've asked Samantha to explain what it is and so on, but from your own perspective, how could a biosphere help you in the work that you do? What do you see as the most important problem you think it could solve for you? Not just solve it, but head some way towards ameliorating it anyway.
Keeping us in a job.
Sorry?
Like keeping us in a job.
Keeping us in a job. That's a very important thing.
Could I just now thank you both very much. It's wonderful to have your time and your expertise. We have Some small
Well,
gifts, small gifts for you. Thank you very much. Much appreciation.
Thanks, John. Is it interesting?
Yeah,
Thank you.
a little lucky dip there for you.
Excellent.
Oh, fruit and veg, great.
Those folk who get the chance, have a look what's inside those bags at some stage and just enjoy some of Liz's work.
Not dry pants, is it?
Aggie's just got a couple of words to say about an event tomorrow. So.
Shopping bags.
Okay, very quickly. Tomorrow it's not going to rain like it is today, so this might be more enticing. But today after lunch, not at Dunkelwin, I really hope not Dunkelwin. But this afternoon you're going to be seeing some of the early restoration sites that these guys have done incredible work on, and you'll be able to ooh and ah and go, this is amazing, what can be done. Tomorrow, they're spearheading a 2.5-hour session on the Princess Dunkeld Road where we've been went along and identified some areas in amongst an amazing grassland, but areas of basically dominated rubbish, which we have partnered with La Trobe University and Regional Roads Victoria, who have been fantastic, and gone along and scalped these areas. And we had hoped to have sown some areas this year, but basically from the day we started scalping, this hasn't stopped. So we actually can't even spray some of the sites. So it will be an opportunity to see, I suppose, a restoration project sort of at the beginning, and some different challenges because it's not nice smooth scalping like it has been here. There's a lot of rocks and things getting in the way. So yeah, we're just having a nice short 2.5-hour walk tomorrow morning, starting at 10 o'clock at the back creek. If you're interested, please come and tell me. And I need to know because I'm providing lunch. Not rubbing anyone's nose in it.
Can I just point out that there hasn't been a drop of rain since we've been sitting inside here, and now that we're about to move out again. So thank you, Woorndoo. You great effort. Someone missed my email apparently. Right. So the plan is that we stop at 12:30, which we haven't done.